Hello, welcome to today's Speakers for Schools broadcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us. We're excited to have you here with us today. Today's talk is a very special one that will be a part of our Black History Month celebration, where we talk to all different people and hear different stories. We're very excited. The month's theme this year is Reclaiming the Narrative, and that is the title of today's talk, Reclaiming the Narrative, Art, Activism and Advocacy. So we're very, very excited to hear from today's speaker. Before I get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. We do have an open Q&A for you all. So if you would like to ask our speaker any questions today, please do submit your questions in the Q&A box. You'll find this just underneath the stream on your screens. And depending on what device you're using, you might have to scroll down a little bit to be able to see this box. And if you find yourself having any sort of technical difficulty or anything like that, please do also let us know via that Q&A box, and one of our moderators will be on hand to help where we can. But now we'll move on to the main event, and I'm very excited to welcome the speaker. She is so wonderful, and we're so happy that she agreed to do this, and I'm very excited to hear what she has to say today. Everybody, please welcome Baroness Lola Young, independent life peer and consultant.
Many thanks indeed to all colleagues at Speakers for Schools. I've been in the House of Lords now for 20 years, which kind of makes me feel even older than I actually am. But I have to say that one of the high points was being asked by Speakers for Schools to join their roster of people who go out to schools and talk to young people. And I was particularly pleased about that because I have a very strong feeling for some of the difficulties, but also some of the joys and pleasures of being a young person in today's world. So it's a bit different from when I grew up, but I'm trying to keep up as much as possible. So yes, a big thanks to Speakers for Schools and all the work that they do. So I love this title as well, Reclaiming the Narrative. What does that really mean? And the art, activism and advocacy bit is where I'm going to focus today. So I'm going to give some examples of some work that I've done, some work that I'm involved in, and just throw out some ideas. Now, half an hour might seem like a long time to sit and listen to somebody, and it kind of is. But by the same token, for the speaker, it's really hard to fit in loads of ideas and concepts and throw them out to the audience in a way that is coherent and makes sense. So I'm going to have to necessarily skim across the surface of some of these things that I want to talk about today. But I think for me, one of the most important things to say is that although 20 years is the most time I've ever spent in any one location that I could call a job, in the House of Lords, my working life for me is defined by my involvement in the arts, cultural and education sectors. I've always loved this idea of being creative and helping to see things in a different way. For myself also, because I love to continue learning. I'm always happy to learn something new about what people that I don't know about or I haven't known about previously, what they're doing in the arts and cultural scenario. It's really, really important for me to try and keep up with that, although it's very difficult. I've worked with artists, and I suppose in some sense I can call myself a creative now, but I've worked with artists, I've worked with creative practitioners, and those that most appeal to me, if I'm being honest, are those that seek to change or to seek to throw light on some of the aspects of society which are not actually great and not actually very pleasant. So let's say addressing things like inequality, poverty, deprivation, and so on. But importantly, I think that arts, creativity, culture, heritage, all of those different areas can be harnessed or can be the motor for changing people's ambitions. Because I think sometimes, particularly with young people, and I'll be interested to hear from you when we open up the conversation later, particularly for young people, I see a lot of structures and systems which sort of inadvertently, let's say, not deliberately, but they end up by limiting people's ambitions and narrowing young people's horizons. So I'm very interested in the ways in which arts and creativity in particular can break down some of those barriers and support some of those ambitions. As far as I'm concerned, being creative is not just the sort of cherry on top of education or life or whatever. It is part of being human. It is part of being a human being to have that streak of creativity, that desire to change things around them, whether that's through painting, writing, dancing, or whatever it is. There are lots of different ways in which you can do that. And there's many, many examples across the centuries that you can point to that contribute to that set of ideas. So I've learned lots of things from these experiences that I've had around this area. And I'm going to try and illustrate what it is I mean with some examples. But I think, again, just to reiterate this point, it is to say that arts, culture, heritage, and creativity are fundamental activities for human beings. And this is why I do feel very, very strongly that in terms of the curriculum and in terms of what we teach and in terms of what we consider to be education, those subject areas should not be left out or be optional or be only reserved for a certain group of people. There's something that we as humans have always done, whether you're talking about craft or whether you're talking about the way in which you dress and create your identity, or whether you're talking about cave paintings from millennia, thousands of years ago. So human beings have always represented in some way or another. And that applies not only to the good times, although of course arts and creativity are very much associated with celebratory events, but it's also in very, very difficult and tragic circumstances. And I'll talk about an example of that later on, where the impulse, the absolute passion and drive is to say, I've got something important and difficult to say, and I'm going to say it using some sort of creative means. And I'm not talking about professional artists either. I'm talking about ordinary, in inverted commas, ordinary people. So sometimes those ordinary people tap into their creative self that they might not even realize that they had before they were forced to find a way of expressing how they felt. But to go back a bit, I feel a bit like I come from the Stone Age myself sometimes, especially when I think about technology. But my first adventure in the world of arts was in theatre. And in theatre, I travelled a lot, performing in theatres around the country, and did a lot of what was then known as theatre in education, or TIE, T-I-E. And I travelled around England doing that, in spite of the fact that there were very, very limited opportunities for Black women in theatre and television. And, just to pinpoint the era I'm talking about the 1970s and the 1980s. But however, there were, as I say, very limited parts available. But I managed to make a living from acting in theatre and on television for several years. Now, it's interesting for me, again, to look back and think on that career and some of the comments that people made about me wanting to be an actor during that period. Because it was, if you think, you can't think back because you weren't even born then. But, I'm talking about a period when there was no such thing as Black History Month. In many people's minds, there was no such thing as Black history, because nobody had kind of really brought to the fore this idea that Black people, not just an idea, this reality of the centuries of time that Black people had been in this country. Excuse me 1 second. So, whenever I think when I was at drama school, I think I was the only Black person in my entire year. And so when it came to casting me in historical dramas, people would say, oh, well, there weren't any Black people around during Shakespeare's time. Oh, you'd be a historical anomaly, they would say, if you were to be in this play, in this production. And it's really, really interesting when I look back on that, compared to today. So although lots of people will say, myself included, that we've still got a long way to go in terms of more equal representation, it is the fact, I think, and again, you can come back at me in the chat later, it is a fact that there are some more opportunities and a little bit more acknowledgement of the fact that Black people didn't just spring into existence in 1948, the year of Windrush in this country. So I didn't know that then, because very few people did. So I had no arguments to produce. Now I would say, well, actually, you can go back further than Elizabethan times, further than Shakespearean times, and find this evidence of these different communities of Black and brown people that have been in Britain all the way back to Roman times and beyond that. So, but there's still a little bit of confusion about what this actually means in terms of casting. And when I say this, what I'm trying to say here is, when I watch something like Bridgerton, for example, which I'm sure some of you at least will have seen, I sort of think, oh my gosh, there's a representation of 19th century Britain, England, English society, not just any old England, but English society, that has basically been cast with Black, brown, all people are truly diverse, a truly culturally diverse cast. So I'm interested in what that might mean, because I don't think it's as straightforward as saying, oh, well, we've won that battle now and everything's all hunky-dory and we can go away and think about something else. So that's one point. But a larger point from what I've said is that history and the concept of heritage really do matter. So conversations on these subjects and the ways in which they're taught and practiced do need to be taken seriously. This relates to the point I was saying earlier about arts and culture and so on being important and not just frivolous cherries on the top of the curriculum pie. But it is also about how we think of ourselves, how we think of not only ourselves today in this moment in time, but what our ancestors, what's our heritage, what are the different influences, what are the different ideas, what are the different practices, what are the different struggles that have taken place before us, of which we're a part. We're a part of that in this moment. And it's always hard to think about, I think, when you're young. But if you try and sort of think in 40, 50 years' time, that people will be talking about us in a very different way, because well, certainly me, will be part of history. We'll be seen to be part of history rather than sort of, living people at that moment. So it's really important to have that sense of kind of continuity and discontinuity. Where are the things that seem the same as they were 20, 40, 50 years ago and more? And where are the things that feel really radically different? And is there really a big gap between those two different sensibilities? So it is really important, as I say, they matter. And I think some of these things do, how can I say, erupt, as it were, into the public consciousness every now and then, when some commentator or other will make some outrageous remark, like saying it's not historically active to have Sikh soldiers in a film about the First World War. Well, it is. And the person and the people that say those kinds of things really haven't done their historical homework. And today it's easier than ever, because all you have to do is Google it, or whatever search engine you use, Google it, and you will find the answers to that question. And you could go down to the National Archives down in South London and find the photographic and written evidence that will tell you all about that, and indeed about Muslim soldiers in the First World War that fought with Britain and so on. So it's not as if the evidence isn't there, it is. So when I come back to this idea about art, activism, and advocacy, that's all wrapped up. I've tried to wrap all of that up in what I've just said, and to stress the importance for me, and I think for all of us, of trying to keep seeking out answers to questions, keep seeking out new questions to ask to get fresh evidence. Excuse me. Right, so that is all, to me, part of reclaiming the narrative. And actually, the one thing I would say about that term, reclaiming the narrative, I might possibly say reclaiming the narratives, because it's important again to stress that if I write a history of the part of London in which I live, that's my way of saying, here's some really important things about this area that I think everybody should know about, and therefore I've written about them in this book. But then somebody else could come along and say, well, actually, I live down the road from you, and I've got an entirely different perspective on what that period was like, or what that area is like. And I can say, in my generosity, well, that's okay. Let's put those two accounts, or let's think of those two different accounts of the same area together, so that we develop a mutual understanding of what crosses over, and what is very distinctively different, and why those differences occur. We don't have to fight about it. We can look, we can compare, we can converse, and we can think about what is going on. So that's a slightly long-winded way of saying there are multiple narratives, and for me it's really important to carry that idea as we look at arts and culture in general. So to me, for my personality, if you like, one of the things that draws me towards arts and this whole kind of sector is that it stimulates my curiosity. And I think that curiosity is such an important part of not just arts and culture, obviously, but education and life in general. Wanting to know about something that you didn't know about before. But for me, the critical, or the most important and joyous aspect of arts and so on, is that inquiry, that curiosity, is fed through a creative way of thinking, so that you can say, oh, that looks interesting, I wonder what that's about. And you can express that curiosity in terms of a painting, or a dance, or a theatre piece, or whatever you want to, because that's what creativity does. It opens up all kinds of new ideas and ways of thinking about everything and every aspect of life, and I'm always up for that. One of the sort of, I'm not going to say case studies, but one of these sort of examples that I wanted to talk about today is about an organisation called Autograph. And Autograph was formed, I don't know, 30 or so years ago. And it was originally called the Association of Black Photographers. And even looking at how that title has changed over the years is an important act to do, because it's broader than the original title would suggest. But it's still got at the heart of it representing underrepresented groups, and with a very strong kind of human rights aspect to it. And I should declare, as I have to say in Parliament, I should declare my interest, because I'm a patron of this organisation, and very proud to be so. And what that means is that I don't run the organisation, I don't look at the day-to-day running of the organisation, but I support it, and I act as a kind of ambassador for it. One of the ingenious things that they've done is, in my view anyway, one of the ingenious things that they've done is to produce an exhibition in a box. And it's great. It's not a big box. It's about the same size as one of those, box files that you can buy in a stationery shop. So it's quite big and it's quite heavy, but it is a whole exhibition. And it's ingenious because it introduces lots of new ideas simply by using images. And again, I'm at the risk of being repetitive. To me, this idea that you can conjure up in somebody's mind an image that completely changes the way they think about a particular period. So, for example, with this exhibition in a box, it has lots of photographs of Edwardians. So Edwardians around the turn of the last century. What's that? I'm sure there'll be history teachers who will correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's around 1901. For about a decade, is called the Edwardian period. So at the beginning of the 20th century. And so Edwardian in many people's minds is very much associated with, a certain way of dressing, certain sort of hairstyles, quite buttoned up. a little bit different to Victorian, but not too dissimilar, etc., etc. We are not used to seeing images of black and brown people in historical artifacts or objects from that period. And yet what they've got, what Autograph have, is a whole exhibition that is based on these calling cards. So I guess I can't think of a modern equivalent today, because if you want to swap numbers, phone numbers or WhatsApp or whatever with a friend or somebody, you just kind of do it electronically, and that's the end of it. But if you can try and think back to a period where not only did that not happen, there weren't even landline telephones. So, we're talking about back in sort of antique times, if you like. And so calling cards were an important way of introducing yourself to people that you didn't know very well. And these calling cards had people's photographs on them. So this exhibition, okay, yes, it's a very interesting set of photographs of Edwardian black and brown people on their calling cards. But when you start to think about it, you think, okay, particularly for a generation like mine, you start to rethink what you thought you knew about that period. Because a lot of people would have said, well, that's before Windrush, so what are those people doing here? I mean, how did that even happen? But there were these communities and individuals around the country who were here. And so the great thing about, I think, creative people is that when they conceive of an idea like this exhibition in a box, they can encourage other people to be creative. So it's not like saying, look at these cards, look at the text that goes with it, and then you know all about this group of people and off you go and go and do another subject. No, it's about thinking, what does that actually mean for the way in which I think about the past? And if we thought so many things about the past like now, what's it going to be like, as I said before, in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years time, when we have more evidence of different things? There might be other incredibly surprising images and calling cards or what have you, or people will then be looking at mobile phones and wondering what the heck these little devices, it's really, really kind of important to understand that kind of flow of histories. We're here in a particular moment. We look back, it's hard to look forward, but if we try and look forward, we see that those people in the future will be looking back on us and what kind of views they have on us. So to me, when I look at the contents of this exhibition in a box, that's part of what I see there. How can we think about what would it be like in 50 years time to look back on our own era? But also, what it suggests within that box, and there's notes for teachers and all the rest of it there, is how you can use the contents in photography or geography or history, or in conceptual terms, in critical thinking and image analysis. There's lots of different ways of using that. Now, I've said that, I've sort of used that as an example, and I am connected to the organisation. This is not about me trying to sell you that exhibition in a box. It's about saying that there are lots and lots of ways of using arts and culture, history, heritage, and all of those kinds of subject areas. And I'm sure most of your teachers who are tuning in today will know this, but sometimes it's difficult to get the right resources. Sometimes it's difficult to find the time, and all of the other issues that I know make life difficult for teachers. But the joy that comes from being able to see children and young people, the look of wonder on their faces as they see something they've not seen before, and then they're stimulated to think about things in a different way. So that was one example that I wanted to draw to your attention. Another organisation that I work with is called the Foundation for Future London. As you will know, I'm sure, I'm very much sort of based in London. I was born in London. I was brought up in London. This is my world, but I'm very much a North London girl, I would say. So this Foundation for Future London works principally in the East End of London. So you may be aware, I've got to think about my math here. Where are we? We're in 2024. Okay, so it's, oh gosh, I can't count. 12 years ago, in 2012, the Olympics took place in London. And one of the kind of part of the legacy of that was a cultural program, but also the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And it's meant to serve, and the organisations based in the park are meant to serve every child, young person, and indeed older people within the boroughs that surround that park. And the Foundation for Future London has been set up to try and make sure that the new and existing arts and educational facilities in the park have a really strong connection with local communities. And one of the ways in which we do this is to ensure that young people have the opportunities. You remember earlier, right at the beginning, I referred to this, sometimes we narrow the ambition, sometimes we narrow and place limits on people. So you can't do this, you can't work in the creative sector because you don't have the right qualifications or attitude or discipline or whatever. What we're saying is that we start from a basis of saying that every young person within the area in which we work should have those opportunities to decide if they want to do that and if they want what they want to follow through on and to develop their ideas. And we have some funds to enable those things to take place. But one of the things that makes our work quite distinctive from some of the other organisations in the area or across London is that we're very strong believers in co-production and co-design. And what this means, put at its simplest, is that the young people or whoever we're working with, they need to be enabled to decide what it is they want to do and how they want to do it. And just to put that in perspective, I've worked with many projects in the arts sector over the years, but with the best of intentions. So say, okay, well, we think this area, what you really need is a dance space, or what you really need is a skateboard area, and this is where we're going to put it, or it's going to be there. And then they build the skateboard area and hardly anybody comes along. And you sort of think, well, okay, that might be because you didn't speak to the people in the first instance who are going to use it. It's not going to be you architects and creatives who are kind of designing this thing. It's not for you. So why don't you work with the people for whom this facility is intended to make sure you get the best possible a space, and you get a space that those young people feel invested in. So that's what we do. We say we will help to support you to decide what it is you want to do. And for us, this is really liberating because it means that if you've got that investment in making something happen, whether that's in fashion or music or film or dance, you can achieve so much more, and you can feel as the people who are working on that, the young people who work in those areas can feel this is our space and we will look after it, and so on. And talking of spaces, one of our latest projects is about creating safer spaces, and I'm sure almost everybody can relate to the need for that. We all, not just physically safe, although that's incredibly important, of course it is, but it's also about feeling, if you're feeling down and you've got difficulties in your life, you need to feel able to find a space where you can express that and get positive help and support for addressing these things. And I would argue that, again, this area of arts and culture is really, really helpful, or can be really, really helpful if it's done properly to support that kind of work. Now, there's just one more example that I want to give, and I'm always a little bit wary about it because it's quite a difficult subject area. Quite a difficult subject area. It's a tragic set of circumstances. So I'm not going to mention the exact details that would necessarily enable you to identify this particular example, but it happens to be one of the most, I would say for me personally, looking at it selfishly, it's one of the most important projects that I've worked on in my kind of, I don't know, 50-year career. And what it taught me was that people who have suffered appallingly, had the most difficult circumstances, and had survived that and wanted to express how they felt about what had happened without any direction. Nobody was saying, this is how you got to present yourself, or this is how you've got to speak about how you feel about what happened to you. Nobody said anything like that. And it was purely voluntary. Nobody was forced to participate. But all those, I would say, of those that participated, I would say 90 to 95% of them chose one form of art and creative work or another to express how they felt, often as is in these cases, in a very emotional way, but also to bring up evidence in a very rational way. So, for example, not just presenting a sheet of paper with words written on them, but making those words into part of a film that was shown during this particular project. Some very difficult subjects, as I've said, were expressed in the form of poetry. These weren't professional artists. So again, it's all to reiterate this point, and also to clarify when I'm talking about art and activism and advocacy, all of that is wrapped up in some of the examples that I've given and in the way that I've spoken. I hope I've managed to make that clear. And again, just to emphasize that this isn't about necessarily producing, thousands and thousands of artists and poets and painters and fashion designers and all the rest of it. It's about finding ways to express, yes, difficult things, but also joy and pleasure and your delight and your enjoyment. And this is what people, I think, are really programmed to do. And somehow we've got to a position where we're saying, no, that's a luxury if you want to study anything to do with the arts. That's just something that is for other people. It's not for you, which is what I was told when I was growing up. I was told, no, you can't work in the publishing industry, which is quite ironic these days. You can't work in the publishing industry. It's not for people like you. Well, people like me is everybody. And I would say the same to you too. And I think that a lot of teachers feel constrained by a system, perhaps, let's put it that way. That means that it makes it difficult to engage with these subjects in a deep way and to exploit how useful and important they are in looking across the curriculum. But I hope that there are organizations and individuals that you can find that you can work with in some way or another, or even found, there's resources. I know that there are some resources that are available that people can tap into and that will enable more people to engage with what I think is such a fantastic subject area. It just happens that the bit of that, the particular bit of that subject area that I'm interested in is about how do we change things for the better for more people. And I would say that advocacy and activism to me are inherently they're embedded in the kinds of arts and culture in which I participate. And just to close, I would say, yes, I recognize that I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to do what I do. And all I would say is that I haven't come from a space of privilege in order to be able to do this. On the contrary. So there are possibilities. Don't be down if you feel that you can't do something that you really, really want to do, because I'm sure there are ways that we as a society can make those situations better. And that's what I'm interested in advocating for. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm sure there's going to be some brilliant questions coming in. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to dive straight in, Lola, to the questions, and I'm going to kick off with this first one. I think it's a really nice one to start with, and it's, how do you view the importance of Black History Month, and what should we take away from it other than just the celebration?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I must admit, when Black History Month first started, looking back, if I'm honest about it, it wasn't that great. It was like, let's do something Black, let's have some steel drums and a few samosas, and then we've done Black History Month. but it's grown much more sophisticated over the years and much more nuanced. So I think now there's some interesting developments. So, for example, some organizations, instead of saying Black History Month, say Black Futures Month. So it's important to look forward. That's not to say necessarily about being celebratory, but it is about looking forward. But to me, yes, let's do that. But we also have to retain that sense of the past, because otherwise we've got a false kind of narrative going forward. So, and then there's another group of people, to which I might belong at some point, which says we don't really need Black History, because we don't need Black History Month. What we need is for those kinds of concepts to be spread throughout the year. And I think that ultimately that's beginning to happen. Might not be happening very quickly, but to me, the final point I'll make on that question is that for me, yes, Black History Month, because that sort of points to a deficit in what we know and what we've been doing so far. But in a wider sense, British history is Black history, brown history, whatever, East Asian, South Asian. It's all of those histories woven into a tapestry. That's how I like to think of it.
Yeah, I like that. And it makes a nice image as well, doesn't it? I think Britain is a very multicultural sort of society. And it's good that we don't forget that. Our next question then is about kind of challenges and sort of what challenges have you faced while you've advocated for kind of social issues, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Oh gosh, all of these questions are really good, and it's like how long have you got? But essentially, loads of challenges. I mean, one person told me a really good way to think about it, because I'm thinking, oh my God, there's loads of people who just don't want to know about this. And so what he said was, if you sort of divide, people into thirds, and you say there's a third that will not engage with you and don't want to have a proper discussion with you, forget about them for now, because they're not going to engage. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got people who are really enthusiastic. And he didn't say this, but I think this, with those really enthusiastic people who are, as it were, on side, then you've just got to keep encouraging them and give them help to point them towards resources that they can use and keep them going, because sometimes that's really important. Then you've got a bunch of people in the middle who are kind of, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, there might be something to this, there might be not, and why are you saying this, and why is that? And they genuinely want to hear you. So that's where the bulk of your energy might be directed, to say to those people who haven't yet sort of completely dismissed it, and who haven't yet come to a point where they accept what you're saying and going on to do their own things, that you say to them, well, look, can we start this conversation again, and let's talk this through. And I think the biggest challenge is people who've already made up their minds and are not into having that discussion. And I come across that a lot.
Yeah, interesting, really. I guess it's good to have a way and have an area to focus your energy as well, because you can never help, deal, or support everybody.
No,
So you'll find yourself having more impact if you focus on one sort of area.
yeah.
All right, we've had a question from Burford School, and they've asked, how has being an ethnic minority affected your career choice? Like, has it affected it? And day-to-day activities around your career?
Okay, so first of all, it's an interesting term, this ethnic minority, and what some people are now thinking about in terms of globally, people of color, black and brown people, whatever. There's loads of different ways of expressing that, and it's interesting that I think that we can come to a position which says, this is how I would self-describe, and this is how you would self-describe, and we may, to all intents and purposes, look the same, but we might have a different way of self-describing ourselves. Or you and I might say, well, we're in the same category because we're female and we did this and blah 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 blah. So that's the important thing to remember about those labels, because essentially labels like ethnic minority are for policy reasons, because it makes it easier for policymakers to put people in a group and say, okay, this is how we're going to deal with that group because we know their characteristics. Lots to unpack there. But in terms of, so I don't sort of think of myself just as, I don't know, Charlie, I can't speak for you, but I can't imagine you go around sort of thinking I'm white, you know, I'm white, because we don't think of ourselves necessarily in that way. But sometimes for some of us, it's brought home to us in a way that is not very pleasant. And that kind of, it happens. Yeah, it still happens quite a lot with sometimes. Yes, it does happen in all the different areas in which I worked, including in the arts. It's happened. And a lot of it stems from, again, this kind of preset idea that says, like, this is just a very, very, very small thing. But I meet any number of people, and have done over the years, who assume that I'm Jamaican, and who assume that I like reggae, who assume that I go to carnival. And honestly, it's not like they set out to be offensive or anything. And I'm not saying I find it offensive. I find it quite funny because I'm none of those things. But, you know, it is this kind of, again, it goes back to, some people have a particular mindset, which is very difficult to break down and sort of explain to them why that's not necessarily the best way of seeing the world. And so that's what I think one of the things that I can contribute to is like saying to people that, you know, try and have a rethink about where you're at and how you see the world. Does that answer the question?
It does, and I agree with you. I think it's one of those things where over the generations it improves. We can see that historically, and we can only continue to do that to kind of erase that sort of mindset. But it definitely takes time for some people, doesn't it?
Mm.
Our next question then. Oh, which question do we pick? Do keep coming questions in if you have anything. Again, we'll have time maybe for just one or two more. So if you've got something, get it in now. I like this one because this is a nice kind of proactive one. So, what's the most effective way, in your sort of experience, that you can challenge a stereotype? I guess this is if you hear someone who makes a stereotypical comment or has that sort of narrative, how can we challenge them in the most effective way through your experience?
That, again, it's a very, very good question, but an incredibly difficult one, because to me, it's kind of context dependent, I would say. And so when I say that, what I mean is, if I'm in a room full of, if I've gone to speak to a group of people who are senior in their profession and who've asked me to come and speak about a particular issue, and then they come up with something that is kind of based on a stereotype or preset ideas or whatever, then I feel that I'm in a position to be able to say to them, look, you know, you've got to rethink that. That needs to be really, really challenged, because we're talking about professional people in the context where they have the ability and the power to change other people's minds. So if they're setting people off on a particular path that's going in one direction that, you know, in many of our views is not the right one, then, you know, we're in trouble. Particularly if they say, look, we're trying to solve the problem of, for example, health inequalities amongst different communities. And then they produce a bunch of people who have no connection to those communities, and who say things that suggest that they've never had any connection with those communities, and therefore they're misunderstanding the problem at the heart of it, and they will not get that problem solved. So I think in that position, it's really important to say, no, absolutely not. You know, you say that. In other contexts, again, it depends, because if I mean, I've had situations where I've been on a bus and people have started, you know, whatever, and I've intervened, and then in other cases I haven't intervened, and if it's a friend, I've just had to say, which has happened, I just had to say, actually, you know, you're not understanding what you've said, and where that lands, and how it feels to people to be on the end of your comment. So and I don't say this is for everybody. I will try not to go into a red mist and start sort of ranting. But then again, I've been pushed. I was in a public sort of space once, pushed into a position where I felt I had to respond robustly. But I don't think humiliating people, this is my view, humiliating somebody who's made an inadvertent comment is not the route I would go down. So I put that all in the negative. So try and put it in the positive is to say I would try and engage with that person, and maybe like, what makes you think that? What makes you think that I really love going to carnival? And but challenging in a way that sort of says, I'm not going to beat you up literally or metaphorically if you give the wrong answer. So yeah, that's my style of dealing with those things.
Yeah, it's like having an open discussion rather than more of a your side, my side debate.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've gotten too much into that, you're with me or you're against me kind of thing. And again, it's like thinking back to what I was saying earlier about the different thirds of people. There will be some people, it doesn't matter what you point out to them about the inconsistencies or the contradictions in what they've said, they will still hold to that view. And so I sort of think, yeah, okay. But the others who kind of, you can have that discussion. You still may not agree at the end of it, but we should each be listening to the other.
Okay, we are at the end of our time with that one. So it's gone pretty quick. So we'll ask a final question, and then you can say any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share as we end. But, I like this one, which is, what do you love most about advocacy?
Oh, now you're appealing to my vanity. No, because it is so yeah, okay. So I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about a piece of legislation that I'd been working on and trying to persuade people. And then we had the general election, so we couldn't pursue it. And we were thinking about how we're going to re-energize this campaign. And somebody said, oh, would like to thank you, Baroness Young, for the work you've done on this. It's made our job so much easier. And, I was genuinely touched by that, because you work, particularly when you're working on these huge issues, huge issues that involve 40 million people being moved around the world against their will, trying to challenge these big things. And it's easy to say, oh my God, I can't do this, it's too big, So just even that little thing about, and if that person says what you've been doing has helped us, then there must be other people who would say that that person, what they've been doing has helped them. Do you see what I mean? So it's like this ripple effect. And I think for me, that is the most encouraging thing, because it would be dispiriting if you thought, not only are you not making visible progress with this problem, but nobody's even listening to what you're saying. That would be like, oh, so many wasted words and what have you. But it's just very, very heartening just to have that one comment was like, okay, yes, I feel ready to go again on that subject.
I love it. Well, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for giving us your insights. It's been a wonderful reflection of the past and the future, which is a nice balance, I think, and really important for us to stop and consider, which is, I guess, what Black History Month gives us, especially while we're in school. It gives us that moment to stop and think about it and consider. So thank you for being a part of that today, and we really appreciate everything you do with us.
And thank you so much to Speakers for Schools for the work that you do, because it's really, really good and much needed. And thanks to everybody who's listened. And I always say this, although with some trepidation, that if you want to email me, I am in Parliament, so you can get my parliamentary email addresses in the public domain. And let me know if ever any of you are coming to Parliament to visit. And I will always try, can't always guarantee, but I will always try and sort of escape my chains in the chamber and come out and speak to people. So thank you all again, and for brilliant questions too.